for just a little bit to look at what the U.S. is doing. And Gary, we've got the three clips. I think let's just play them back to back. First with Austin, then with our favorite Admiral John Kirby, and Pentagon spokeswoman Singh. Gary, go ahead and hit it.
I've ordered the USS Abraham Lincoln to replace the USS Theodore Roosevelt later this month. I've also ordered more cruisers and destroyers capable of ballistic missile defense to the region. And I've ordered the deployment of another fighter squadron to the Middle East to reinforce our defensive air support capabilities there. These posture adjustments add to our already broad range of capabilities in the region. And we remain ready to deploy on short notice to meet evolving threats to our security, our partners, or our interests. The United States remains intensely focused on de-escalating tensions in the region.
We have to be prepared for what could be a significant set of attacks, which is why we have increased our force posture and capabilities in the region, even in just the last few days.
We're certainly sending a message, and that is one of deterrence. We certainly do not want to see a regional conflict or a wider war spread out in the Middle East. And so the movements that the Secretary announced on Sunday with the expedited movement of the Abe carrier strike group moving into the region, I think sends a huge message of deterrence. I mean, that carrier has F-35 aircraft on it, and previously, before the announcement that the Secretary had made on Sunday, we'd also bolstered our air power presence in the region with an additional squadron of F-22s. The message that we're sending is clear. It's one of deterrence and one that we will come to the defense of Israel should we need to if Iran were to attack.
So, Colonel, I'm going to give you Mission Impossible here. The United States is sending everything that's floating and flying to the Middle East, and we're de-escalating. So can you connect those two ends for me here to make sense of it, please?
That's a little bit like squaring the circle, huh? That's it. No, I think, in fact, what the spokeswoman just said is, in fact, exactly the point. I mean, my personal view is that the U.S. doesn't want to be committed and doesn't want to be involved in any kind of conflict. I mean, especially when it comes, I mean, what I mean is that the US doesn't want to send boots on the ground. And the forces they send, in fact, if you look at it, these are just standoff weapons. These are counter missile forces, and my personal view is that they're committed to support Israel. So that's a constant in the U.S. policy, and that will not change. So they will help Israel if there is any missile attack from Iran, and Iran will probably not send ground troops, but probably have air attack by missile and all that. And the U.S. is ready to support Israel in countering those missile attacks. So that's my view, but they have a deterrent force to, let's say, to avoid an escalation of the conflict. The thing is that when they say they don't want an escalation of the conflict, that means they don't want to be involved. I think that's a clear message to Israel that they will not provide boots on the ground, even if you have this amphibious group in Mediterranean, the WASP group. I don't know if it's still there, but it used to be in the East Mediterranean. But I'm not sure. These are mostly amphibious troops and US Marines and all that. I'm not sure they will send these troops on the ground. They're just there to show the flag, in fact, to flex the muscle somehow. But I'm not sure the US has any willingness to engage physically soldiers on the ground. They will do exactly what they have done in April. That means just supporting, sending a few missiles to complement what Israel has, and they will do that. I mean, the thing is that right now in the U.S., I think, I'm not sure the Biden administration I'm not sure it has the right strategy for that, but I think they try to avoid the conflict. I mean, the success for Biden would be to start a negotiation process or a dialogue process. That would be the success. And my personal view is that the US is trying to do so, to press the Israeli into a negotiation process. And that would already be some kind of success. But having an open war in the area would certainly be would be a failure for the Biden administration. But we see that the Israeli attack on Tehran is, in fact, was received in the U.S. exactly the same way the Ukrainian attack in the Kursk region, and
Right.
namely that the US were kind of surprised of that, didn't approve these because again they are in a situation. I mean, I'm talking about the Biden administration now. They are in a situation where they don't want to have they don't want to degrade the situation. They don't want to have this conflict to extend. They would prefer to have a process in which they could show themselves as the one who promoted a solution. But extending conflict is definitely no solution. It's no solution in Ukraine. It's no solution in Israel. And what we see in both theaters is that the U.S. is not listened to. And that's
Yeah.
the most concerning thing, in fact, in these in both theaters, that there is no voice to calm down the situation. I mean, since the beginning of the war, the special military operation in Ukraine, as well as the start of the Operation Al-Aqsa Flood from the Palestinians, you had absolutely no voice in the West that contributed to calm down the situation. You had the European diplomacy is inexistent. Nobody has heard and seen any diplomat in this region. They have absolutely no voice. Nobody listened to them. I mean, they are totally absent. The only voice that could raise the voice and could advise the stakeholders would be the US. But as we see since October, the Israelis, and specifically Netanyahu, does whatever he wants without listening to the US. He listened
Right.
to the US when it's convenient to him, but as soon as the US tries to calm him down, the Netanyahu turns a blind eye to what Biden says, and that's exactly the same thing in Ukraine. So the what concerns me in that respect is that you have absolutely nobody who is able to have a grip on the situation in the West. I mean, they are emotional. And that's normal that in wartime you start to be emotional somehow. I mean, we would prefer to have some kind of rational thinking and all that. But the fact of the matter is that when you are at war, you tend to be irrational and emotional. So that the actors are irrational and emotional, we can understand that.
Yeah.
The problem is that no voice outside of these actors can have a grip on the situation and can advise them because they are listening to nobody. And that's the interesting thing. Well, the Iranians are listening to what the Russians say, they are listening to what the Chinese say, they are listening even to the US say, because as you rightly pointed out, before counterattacking in April, they consulted through Oman, I think. They consulted the US, and they wanted two things, and that's very interesting, nota bene, from the Iranians. On the one hand, they wanted to convey the message to the US that they didn't want to destroy Israel, so they didn't want to expand the conflict. And on the other hand, they wanted to hear from the US that the US would not intervene in the conflict. And
Yeah.
they were
Yeah.
very prudent and very cautious in advancing in that in their response by listening to the actors. And that shows that the Iranian leadership, in my view, is probably more rational than the Israeli. By the way, as we can see, when it comes to the possible extension of the conflict and all that, to whom ask we to have restraint? We ask the Iranians. Nobody asks the Israelis because
Right.
we know that the Israelis will never exert restraint. But the Iranian, we consider them as more rational, and therefore we ask them to exert restraint. That shows that we have implicitly we have a better opinion of the Iranian than of the Israelis. That's
Well, yeah, and in fact, one of the things we're looking at though is the decline of U.S. Influence and leadership. Uh, let's go back 70 years. Now, to put this into context, think of the time from 1880 to 1950. That's only 70 years. Yet, boy, World War One took place in that time. World War Two, the Great Depression. So when you're young and you look at that kind of time frame, you think that's a long time. And yet, I was born in 55. Here I am approaching 70. And it was in 1953, 54, the Suez Crisis, and where France, England, Israel were invading Egypt. But at that time, the United States stood there and says, whoa, stop,
exactly.
and, or else. And we were able to stop right there. Today, I think we're in a situation. Have you ever been in an airplane and the plane's taken off and you look up the aisle and the cockpit door is open and there's nobody in the pilot's seat? That's sort of where we are right now. We're not sure who's flying the plane or who's driving the bus.
Absolutely.
And as a result of that, you get what we've seen here with Israel acting with impunity. And you're spot on with Iran is behaving like a mature state.
Exactly.
They're making sure that they check all the diplomatic boxes, because when I think they believe conflict's inevitable, but when it comes, they're going to be able to say, "Hey, we went through the UN, we went through the Islamic states, we tried every route, and nobody would step up and say, 'Hey, Israel, cut that out.'"
Absolutely.
So
I totally concur with you. This is absolutely true. It's exactly that. We have lost, and the West basically has lost credibility. I mean, Europe anyway, because it's interesting that regardless of how you may see the influence of the US, good, bad, insufficient, or so, but at least there is someone. I mean, when there is a problem, we look towards the US. Nobody looks towards the European Union, and that's also something. The Europeans are totally absent. They are totally absent. They are totally absent. I mean, they provide weapons, that's all. But diplomatically, politically, they are totally absent from the
yeah,
conflict in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And they are not listened to. And even you could see, even with France, they are kicked out of Mali, kicked out of Niger, kicked out of Burkina Faso. Nobody wants
yeah,
them anymore. You see, so that means that the credibility of the West and specifically from the Europeans, this credibility is dead, and nobody wants
yeah,
to listen to them.
yeah,
When you see how Macron and others behave, how can you listen to these guys? I mean, they are lunatic. They don't have any concrete and defined strategy to address problems. They are ignorant. They are. I mean, I would even say stupid sometimes because they
yeah.
have some reactions that are childish, so childish that how can you have some kind of credibility for these guys? So this is very. I think it's a dramatic situation that we are witnessing today.
Yeah, that's what makes it so dangerous, this political drift. I think when we look at the European leadership and American leadership, that to call them, political, intellectual midgets would be an insult to midgets. I mean, they are. It's just it's appalling. Uh, we're going to be. I'll be interviewing Ambassador Chaz Freeman tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive, And I remember Ambassador Freeman from my time at State, and there really were still some men and women of real stature and maturity that were in charge back then, and I'm just appalled by what I see today across the board, both at Pentagon, military leadership, as well as the diplomatic leadership. And I think you're seeing that as well. Let me, with respect to that, this shifts the conversation a little bit in a direction I didn't anticipate. But can Europe hang together going forward? Because they're going to be facing a defeat in Ukraine with NATO, with the Russians prevailing there, and with their inability to have any kind of influence in the Middle East. Does Europe, does the unity stay together?
There is something rotten in the kingdom of Denmark, as as
Yeah.
Hamlet would say. If you look at Europe, in fact, it never managed to have a common um, uh, foreign policy. It never managed to have a common defense policy. You still have very distinct interest. I mean, definitely France has interests in Africa, or had at least some interests in Africa, but other countries such as Estonia, for instance, or the Baltic states, have absolutely no interest in Africa. Finland or the Nordic states have absolutely no history with Africa. So meaning that the interests that you might have and interests that might translate into military effort or defense policy, you see that there is huge discrepancies within Europe. And that's exactly the reason why, when they talk about the defense of Europe and all that, it's a fiction, because before having a common defense policy, you need to have a consistent foreign policy, because at the end of the day, defense policy is linked or closely related to your foreign policy. If you're not able to have the same one, I mean, how can you have a defense policy? Look at what we have in Ukraine today. We have Hungary and Slovakia, who are extremely reluctant to continue feeding this conflict for several reasons. I mean, Hungary has a Hungarian minority in the western part of Ukraine. And since 2014, this Hungarian minority is subject to exactions from the Ukrainian government. The Hungarian have complained repeatedly to the European Union, the Council of Europe, and the Europeans have never done anything because it was Ukraine. Today, when it comes to continuing to support this conflict, your Hungarian are saying stop. So we see that within Europe itself, you have those differences. Now, looking at China, you had Italy, who used to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Then, under the pressure of Europe, they decided to withdraw from this Belt and Road initiatives, and they said that a few months ago. By that was last year, they said to China they would abandon the project. And today, what happens? You have Mrs. Meloni going to China, asking China to come back into the. So we see that the Europe suffers from a lack of coherent foreign policies. They suffer from a lack of vision of what is the future. We see Germany. I mean, this is probably the most blatant example of stupidity, where they inflict to Russia sanctions that in fact have as a only effect to affect German economy. And the German economy is suffering from that. They are putting sanctions on China, although China is the biggest market for German cars. But they put sanctions. I mean, not sanctions, but they try to raise the tariffs with the European Unions and all, European Union. So meaning that today the Chinese say to the Germans, guys, we have nothing to do with you. And the German economy now is is crying to have to keep on the Chinese market. So uh, we have totally inconsistent strategies, inconsistent foreign policies, no common view on what we want to achieve. Even in Ukraine, I mean, helping Ukraine to defend, okay, but for what purpose? To reach what objective? I mean, as we see today, and as we have seen in my first book, Operation Z, that I published in October 2022, describes exactly the situation we are witnessing today in Ukraine. So nothing mysterious in that. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm just analyzing the facts as they are. I'm not trying to make some kind of wishful thinking. But it seems that our politicians are just dreaming. I mean, they're not considering the facts. They are just hoping. It's a strategy based on hope, but it's not the way you conduct a war, and that's exactly the problem we are witnessing today in Ukraine. And the more we want to help Ukraine, the more we create a catastrophic situation for Ukraine. As a result, we are destroying the main enemy of Ukraine. In fact, is not Russia. Is Russia militarily,
Yeah.
definitely, but from a more economic and a more broader context. I mean, Europe has made every single move you may want to do if you wanted to destroy Ukraine,
Yeah.
because the Russians didn't want to destroy Ukraine, by the way. They just wanted to destroy a military potential, a military threat, not the country. The country was destroyed by the Europe, not by Russia. If we want to summarize a little bit the situation, the Russians had never declared they wanted to occupy Ukraine or to seize Ukraine. They didn't even say they wanted to seize territory, because, as you may remember, in
Right.
March 2022, the Russians were ready to give back all the territories they conquered in the early stage of the operation. So, meaning that territory is not the objective of the Russians. They wanted to eliminate the threats towards the Russian speaking part of the Ukrainian population. And that was it. Basically, that was what the Minsk agreements were saying. But
Yeah.
they tried, since nobody wanted to implement them, then the Russians tried to enforce them through military means. That's all. The rest, all the distraction, has been done by the European, because they were not able to understand. They defined themselves what the Russian objectives were. They decided that the Russians wanted to take over the whole of Ukraine, and based on that uh, uh, imaginary objective, they created a policy towards Ukraine that, in fact, leads Ukraine into the problem. And there is no sign that anybody in the European Commission is changing course on that. So
Yeah.
we are heading towards a distraction of Ukraine, and yes, so be
No,
it.
I think, yeah, I think what we're going to see for the next 2 months are some of the most momentous changes. They will be as consequential for in future history when they look back. That this will be a time when the let's call it the U.S. controlled international based order really came to an end, and the new international order with BRICS at the center of it started to emerge. Colonel, listen, I've taken up more than an hour of your time, and I